Hello and welcome to the final episode of Sinews of War. In the previous episode we were attacked by the Iroquois Confederation. In mere seconds they overran the forces we had in Upper Louisiana and took the province from us, but we had counterattacks on the way. Far away in India we lost a seemingly easy battle against the Maratha Confederacy when our forces tried to advance up the coast to retake some lost territory, so that campaign has been stalled. We were though able to take a territory from Persia that linked our Indian territories to Europe, now giving us a massive continuous land empire. From western France, Lord Vermes departed with an inconspicuous fleet and a large army to go and try to complete this campaign for us. Russia declared war on us, and one of their first moves was to attack St. Petersburg with a very well-equipped stag. The defenders inside fought long and hard, especially Voss's personally trained militia units, but in the end they could not resist the enemy, although inflicted heavy casualties on them. Finally, we were able to take Niagara from the Iroquois Confederation, splitting their territories apart and proving that victory against them was possible. All I need to do now in the campaign is take New York from the 13 colonies and I will have won. So before we look into the specific events of the campaign coming to a close, I'll just show you the last tiny bits of gameplay I have. First, I'm scouting out the region of New York. Of course, the city of New York is that dock. Albany is the actual target here, just to be clear, but we can go through New York in order to get to Albany. So before that I just wanted to wait one more turn so I could build up some money in order to make the 13 colonies one final peaceful offer. So with the final turn I go to besiege the final Mughal Empire stronghold up in the mountains, and I'm also sending more forces east to head towards Calcutta, where we need to take out the last of the Maratha Confederation. Looks like we are on track to completely dominate India. I also wanted to redeem my honour and retake Upper Louisiana from the natives who took it from us so easily last time. Luckily, I have 1.5 stacks available to go and recapture it, and that's going to prove pretty easy. You can see the balance bar super far in our favour. We're going to take the auto-resolve. As I said before, the auto-resolves are very generous against Native American armies, which are actually a lot stronger than the game rates them when it comes to battlefield performance. But we're going to skip over that and just assume control of the province. You can see the natives have torn down all the vestiges of our civilization, so we'll have to start rebuilding it, unfortunately, but of course that doesn't really matter. The long-term economy of the empire isn't going to be important when there's only one turn left. So the war with the Iroquois is effectively over because they have no more forces. Now it's time to go to the 13 colonies and make some final offers. What we want to do is try and trade New York and offer them some of our own regions in exchange, some regions that we're not going to need in order to complete the campaign. So first I'll demand from them the region of New York, and now just start going through my regions to see what I think would be a reasonable trade. And I'm also going to throw in tons of money, of course, as well. My final offer is this one here. I'm going to give them the territory I captured from the Iroquois Niagara, just over to the west of New York, and I'll give them the Windward Islands down in the Caribbean to add to their bases. I'll give them 50,000 in money, and I'm going to randomly throw in some military tech since the 13 colonies are backwards in that regard. So, pretty good offer, and they outright rejected, even though it would have massively benefited them to accept that offer. That was a huge loss to myself, short term and long term. So, it seems the 13 colonies simply will not be giving up New York. So now we need to start looking into the fact that we're going to have to go to war, not just with them, but with Britain. Fortunately for me, it seems the one region faction of Courland has Britain under siege. There's no British fleets in the Channel, and their armies are stuck near London, blockaded by Courland's navy. So I don't know what's going on between those two, but this is going to benefit me massively. I'll start building up a fleet just in case we need anything, but it looks like the situation is perfect to go ahead with our plan. To prepare for the worldwide Velvet Revolution they had planned, the Club of London needed executive control over the Dutch India companies. The structure of the companies would make it easy for them to enact their suite of social reforms without legal opposition. In Europe, they would have to rely on the personal influence of King Willem IV to sway the States General, supported by generous amounts of backroom deals to win additional stadtholders and military officials over to their side. By 1726, the East India Company had already bound itself to the personal authority of the club's agents. In Europe, the social equality angle played well with the vast numbers of recently enfranchised non-Dutch people, giving them a strong mandate to overrule the opposition of their many detractors in the military and noble households. But the West India Company remained out of their reach. Their board of directors, steered by the paranoid Director General and company founder Cobus Lodovics, had worked for some years to establish autonomy from Europe. The vast resources of their American territories had made it easy. So far it had come that they were on the precipice of outright treason to their nation, protected from explicit accusations by the power of their company charter. King Willem was forced to take an alternative approach to the problem. If the company would not give itself up to him, he would take it. Europe's military power vastly outmatched the company's forces. All he needed to do was take a staging point from which he could invade their colonies, and the mere threat of such an event would force them to capitulate. Selected for the task was the British colony of New York. But there was a problem. The king found that suddenly his associates in the Club of London were hesitant to make such arrangements. Many were unwilling to give up control of a long-established stronghold of club interests. The 13 colonies had in fact only been formally established as an accessory to a failed reform scheme of the club's distant past. They insisted that non-military means be taken, and that they be taken quickly, leaving the issue with King Willem to solve with threats to the effect that his failure would void his invitation to their meetings. That was not the result the king needed. In truth, the military expedition had already been dispatched, with orders to occupy New York, commission new ships and troops from those of the British held in reserve there, and then to sail straight for the company headquarters at Antigua. Without help from the insider influence of the club, the king had sealed in war with the British Empire itself. His only hope was that he could deliver results so quickly that the club would accept a compromise and arrange a peace with all parties returning to their original holdings. The only difference being that the new Director General of the West India Company would be Lord Wybrand Vermeers, the king's man. All he could do then was await news of the success of his expedition and a copy of the newly revised and implemented company charter. When Lord Vermeers arrived in the harbour of New York, he found no supplies awaiting him. It became clear from the demeanour of the local governor that the king had failed to make any arrangements for his stop-off there to be brief, and so it fell to the clause of his orders where he was to secure anything he felt he needed by any means he saw fit. Meeting no opposition from the astonished locals, the Dutch army disembarked into the city and marched north to the region's military and administrative hub, Albany. His vanguard delivered to them terms of surrender, removing any chance for the British officials to give his brash actions benefit of the doubt. The terms demanded not only a large volume of supplies, but that the troops themselves join his army to accompany the expedition. Such unheard-of demands were unlikely to succeed, and Vermeers knew that well. He had simply given due diligence to the diplomatic process before his troops stormed the ill-prepared defences of the colonists and took all they wanted. A state of war was now to exist between Britain and the United Provinces. Vermeers had to work on a tight time frame. He had to take Antigua before any British ships could travel back to Europe, or indeed the British-American headquarters at Jamaica. Moving with speed, he had a chance of ending the war before news of its commencing even reached the ears of the British people. He locked down the ports of New York, forcing the news to travel overland to Plymouth in New England before it could begin its journey east. Then his own ships launched, mostly heading south towards Antigua, but a few already heading east to provide preemptive news of his success. Facing no opposition at sea, his men raced to make landfall on the islands, and then raced to climb the steep hill to the West India Company headquarters, still seeing no sign of company troops or guards, only surprisingly ambivalent townsfolk. After searching the building with bayonets drawn, Vermeers' men were finally able to show their lord to the desk of Director General Lodovics himself, behind which he still sat, apparently disturbed from his writings. "You are under arrest for treason. Come with me at once," Vermeers announced in triumph. "Have a seat, my lord," the elderly Lodovics offered in response, his eyes still scanning the drying ink on his page. The two soldiers on Vermeers' flanks moved forward to grab him, but Vermeers halted them with a swaying hand. "You are Cobus Lodovics." Lodovics pointed at the open door behind Vermeers, where his name was engraved on a gold plate. Satisfied his guest had seen it, he passed his page aside to join a gathering pile and wetted his pen to continue on a fresh sheet. "Come with me now!" "Please remain calm, my lord." Finally Lodewijk looked up at the red-faced man standing before his desk. "I understand your enthusiasm, but I'm afraid to say you've misread the situation entirely." Vermes snapped, grabbing the pages from the desk and scattering them across the floor. He was about to motion for his troops to seize Lodewijk when the man suddenly stood. "Wybrand, you're not to blame. You need to see the king and his little friends for what they are." The calmness of his voice seemed to ease Vermes, who hesitated to watch Lodewijk step over to a service bell on the wall and ring it. Suddenly there was a loud scraping noise echoing around the room. Before it was over, muskets were levelled at Vermes and his men from all directions. Not a single bookcase in the room or adjacent hall had not moved aside to reveal gangs of armed company privateers. The sound of a brief struggle on the floor above them was a temporary distraction from the advancing muzzles and blades. "The thing about the king," Lodewijk continued, "is that he is immensely stupid. And so, I have found, are all those that follow him. They are the sorts of people who will believe it possible to take the new world from its ruler by simply asking him to give it up. They are the sorts of people, my lord, who will not check the south side of the island to see if the company fleet, 4 times the size of their own, is moored in the coves. And as we can see, they don't check who's hiding behind the furniture. But I can forgive that last mistake. It was awfully clever after all." "You will hang! No, worse! You're a dog, Lodewijk!" "Still doing fairly well for myself though, eh?" "My army will tear you apart!" No, it won't. Your army of Russian peasants will be informed how much more we pay our troops over on my side of the table, and they will discover, no doubt, that this town is brimming with buccaneers who eat new arrivals for breakfast. If your army still exists out there, they are stitching my colours to their arms as we speak." Unable to speak, Vermes fell silent for a time, before finally letting out a gasp at the sound of a rolling thunder from outside. Out of their view, the company fleet was crushing a burning line of fleeing European ships. The king's plot had failed. The West India Company joined hands with the British to oppose the States General, and Lord Vermes found himself appointed the governor and only resident of a bank of sandy islands somewhere east of the Bahamas. In Europe, the stadtholders were outraged to hear the news and fought with all their power to distance themselves from the king. Although the full extent of the issue had not reached the common people, it soon would. The king was suddenly on his own, while old guard republicans were out in full force ready to deliver his Royal Highness's head to the British as a sign of goodwill. Willem was quick to insist that Vermes was a defector to the West India Company, which, by his own proclamation, was now in open rebellion. Public opinion split down the middle on whether to take such a claim seriously. His own uncle, King Willem III of England, was among those having a hard time believing the story. An ultimatum from the club was delivered to the Dutch king: gain control of the West India Company within 1 year or be replaced. The British government was convinced, in the confusion, to truce for the same period, ending the immediate crisis. Struggling to gain traction in the States General, the king played his last card, the East India Company. He called upon their forces to gather in France to prepare a westward invasion, but fearing the West India Company's large fleets would intercept their movement, they were to make the journey overland through the recently conquered and increasingly lawless Persian territories. 3 months after the troops were dispatched, news reached Amsterdam that they had halted. Initially, the story of the reason why was beyond the king's belief, but it was confirmed when he received a letter from the Bishop of Jerusalem, one Harm van Cortlandt. It seemed the East India Company had done such a good job of spreading the Christian faith in India that their forces were happy to disobey orders from their commander, General de Beer, when the governor of the Christian Holy Land decreed that they do so. The king had been checkmated. Now he sat on an empire asking whether they were at war with Britain or not, and refusing to believe they were at war with the American colonies. His old favourite commander, Lord Uvata, was tied up negotiating for peace with Sweden and Russia, and his last European army, the force of General Adrian Gaydon, was out of contact, having disappeared into Prussian territory. He was finally out of options. Even he could see that he was personally starting a world war by not abdicating and taking responsibility for all the year's events. Yet he still remained in power, no longer present at the States General, but instead sitting deep within the palace, waiting for the decision to be made for him by the leagues of protesters besieging his gates day and night. And then, as tended to happen to great men in a time of crisis, a certain individual paid him a visit. "I must see His Majesty at once," he said to the servant at the door. If he had got past the guards at the gate, then there must be some merit to him, but the servant had plenty of good reasons to be wary. "His Majesty is not taking visitors," he insisted, moving to close the door. "Tell him that his good friend Mr. Voss is here to see him," the visitor quickly said, placing a gentle hand on the wrist of the servant to keep him from the door handle. The servant, turning white in recognition of the name, wordlessly complied. Under the watch of several guards, Voss advanced to stand before the seated king in his luxurious reception room. "Bit of a situation you got yourself into, Your Majesty. And I won't have it ended by the likes of you. If you must take assassin's work, ply it against someone of your own standing. Such a rude thing to say to the only man in the Golden Empire willing to offer you help." The king said nothing in response, but Voss noted the widening of his eyes and continued. "As you may have schemed yourself, if you were to travel to London and meet your uncle in person, with a prepared apology of course, the situation might be diffused." "Will you take me?" "Exactly. My army stands minutes away. You, your family, and any possessions you can fit into your carriage can be safely escorted to somewhere quieter, France perhaps. From there we shall have no trouble arranging your discreet departure. I have but one condition, one request to make of you in exchange." When Voss offered help, he was rarely refused. That was the source of his rapid rise to notoriety, and this would be no exception, for the king's fear of whatever scheme Voss was hiding was outmatched by the fear of the more clear and violent schemes of the people he claimed to rule. Voss's condition was agreed to despite its huge and audacious size, and preparations began. The same night, thousands of armed men cleared a path through the crowds and stood as human barriers to keep it open. The gates of the palace opened, and from it first came Voss, partially hidden by a thick cloak, riding with a few companions. After a company of jogging troops came a carriage of king's guards, followed closely by the audaciously decorated royal carriage, a coronation gift from the very same King of England he was now heading to see. Another carriage of royal guards was planned to follow to the rear, but it found itself halted by the closing of the palace gate before it had departed. As the passengers got out to argue with the fully equipped but strangely unfamiliar-looking gate guards, Voss and his followers sped up to leave the corridor his troops had created. Few in the crowd were paying him any attention, given his rough and common appearance in comparison to the glittering decor of the gilded carriages. Suddenly, almost as soon as Voss was away, gunshots echoed over the crowd from the palace courtyard. The guards of the final carriage were determined to follow their liege whether it was really their own comrades trying to stop them or not. Without any hesitation, the troops holding back the crowd threw their weapons to the floor and turned to fade into the suddenly advancing wall of clamouring Republicans, some now armed with the freshly discarded weapons. The panicked carriage drivers tried to speed up, trampling many of the advancing mass, but the weight of it forced them to stop. Driven by the sound of gunfire from behind them, the soldiers fired into the crowd with everything they had, but in comparison to the attacking force they had little. As Voss slipped away with his troops, the king's carriage was overturned and the doors were torn open. Stories of all that happened next would invariably focus on the actions of the angry mob and not on the cloaked man who had passed by just before. But Voss would not be spared troubles. The consequences of the conditions he had placed on the king came into effect that very evening. Word of it spread fast, and everywhere it spread there was outrage which fueled those discontents for reasons of all kinds to finally look to their gunsmiths for aid. Hearing the news, General Gaiden negotiated a hasty and unfavourable truce with the Russians and sped back to Amsterdam with all the cavalry he could muster along the way. He found Voss's army camped outside the surprisingly peaceful city. "Gerard, what is the meaning of all this?" Gaiden demanded as he first entered the commander's tent, seeing the man he had once fought side by side with and noting how his appearance was strangely unchanged from nearly 10 years prior. "It means I have to put on a certain hat and sit in a certain chair. Voss replied, standing to offer a handshake and a smile that Gaiden took blankly. "And how exactly did you get the king to agree? It was that, or he died by the hand of some assassin. Not me, but someone like me. And he only made me fourth in line to the throne, wasn't like I was asking to be heir apparent. But by some accident that seems to be what has happened. The will of the people cannot be ignored," Voss quipped, beckoning Gaiden to join him before a carefully drawn map of Western Europe. "But it can be made rather quieter, if only the king knew." The situation, as he explained, was that a pro-Willem revolt was building momentum, spurred on by the previously rather anti-Willem stadtholders, who would much rather see some distant relative dug up to take the throne than see the late king's will put into action. Voss's plan was threefold. Firstly, as acting head of state, he would grovel as much as was required to end the tensions with Britain and return their colonies to them with ample compensation. Secondly, he would silence the stadtholders by giving them back all the powers the king had taken, for at least as long as there was no king, for he himself seemed to have no intention of actually exploiting the success of his sudden adoption to the royal family. Finally, he would march out with his army to cement the control of the empire over the discontented provinces, all in the name of the duly elected States General. Gaiden quickly realised that, as usual, his astonishment at Voss's actions was unfounded, for the man had everything under control. And the plan was sound, so sound that for the following months Gaiden found himself once again riding beside the world's most famous commander, a temporary warrior king. The enemies of the monarchy, the republic, the tax office and the one true god were all summarily disarmed. By the time they returned to Amsterdam, the empire was enjoying an unprecedented peace. The wars in India were won. The truce with Russia had turned into a weary peace, and Britain was once again the empire's closest political ally and economic rival. With the chaos over, the great question returned. What would Voss do with his legal mandate to take the empire's throne? From his humble residence of a tent tactfully placed just outside the gates of the royal palace and surrounded with similar structures housing his victorious troops, he told Gaiden the answer to that question. "There's only one man with an untarnished reputation, noble blood and the support of the people," Voss announced, "and that is you, my friend. You needn't joke." "Correct, and I didn't. The crown's not too comfy, but given your dress sense, I imagine that's not going to be an issue." "Gerard, I can't be king, it's ludicrous." "It's quite easy. You can't pretend you don't have the skill for it. I've seen you campaign from here to Asia, and I think every man you commanded over those years will agree with my decision. But if you really wish to disobey the divine will of the king, then see if you can find me someone better. I'd be happy to consider an alternative if you can be the first to find one." "This is..." Gaiden was forced to silence by the weight of the offer, if it could be considered an offer rather than a command. It was true that the only public figures with enough support to stand a chance were he and a few stadtholders, but the stadtholders were constitutionally forbidden from accepting royal favours, up to and including the throne itself. He was, as far as he could see, the best choice, a realisation that forced him down into the nearest chair. And what will you do?" he finally managed to say. "Well, that is quite a question. There is an answer to it, but I'm afraid I can't tell you in full until the time is right. Suffice to say, I'm needed in London." A few weeks later, Voss was once again gone and uncontactable, and Gaiden found himself sitting before a begrudging States General, once again stripped of various powers, with the dual task of winning them over while holding his huge empire together. But both would prove easy, for the spoils of the long wars of the last decades were now rolling in. Of the events of Gaiden's rule, which is chiefly outside the concern of this first volume, let's detail only a few. The West India Company saw its Director General arrested for the murder of Lord Vermes, among plenty of other charges. The colonies were offered a vote on becoming full territories of the United Provinces, and many did, getting their own stadtholders in Amsterdam and some freedom from the arbitrary rulings of the company courts, in exchange for rather increased rates of taxation. The changes to the East India Company Charter enacted by Willem were reverted, leaving them once again confined to India, Eastern Africa and the East Indies. Its chief task was now to turn its large territories into an economic success, and of course to press Protestantism into the population as deeply as could be done. They were joined by a new neighbour, the West Asia Company, a new organisation formed to rule the domain of the Ottoman Empire, an area which proved ill-suited to the legal and social systems forced on those ruled by Amsterdam. Unlike the other companies, no Director General was appointed to have overall control, leaving the administration rather indecisive but at least safe from misuse. The young Bertrand Calember of the West India Company was one of those chosen to be on the board, where he would find enough success to eventually graduate into the Stadtholders of Europe. The only part of their territory that the West Asia Company did not control was Jerusalem. By the wishes of a popular movement among the increasingly large global Christian population, it was made an autonomous state of its own to rival Vatican City, led by a pair of prince-bishops who, it was said, would rule by communicating directly with God. Chosen for the first incarnation of these roles were none other than the Bishop of Jerusalem, Hard van Cortlandt, and the man who had nearly single-handedly brought salvation to India, the Bishop of Ceylon, Jeroen Grasdijk. Their rule over the city would not end peacefully, but that really is beyond the bounds of this volume. By 1730, the Golden Empire was truly and fully established. It would grow in economic power by the graces of technological progress and the conquests of its military, all the while continuing to progress its hardline capitalist ideology to its logical conclusion. As we know, there would come a point when the concentration of capital, of power, would be so dense that the economic powerhouse would see its foundation, the people, crumble. And of that, all we shall note here is that one should consider the fact that when the resultant chaos ended, the name Voss, so familiar in this tale, was known the world over. Finally, the tale comes to an end, so that's been Sinews of War. I've been officially Devin, and all that remains to say is a massive thanks to my patrons for making this happen, and of course to everyone who's watched and supported the series. Stick around on the channel for a new narrative LP starting in a couple of weeks, where the governor of Britannia, witnessing the fall of Rome, goes rogue on a mission to restore the glory of his empire and save his people from the Dark Ages. That's all for now, thanks again for watching, and God save Emperor Voss.